Hello, everyone. Sorry for the delay. Having trouble getting the headset going. Just going to check the audio real quick, make sure we are good. You all know what time it is. It is time for the Average Intelligence Podcast. And some of you are probably confused right now, but I will get into that in just a second. Oh, it's watching me now, I think. Okay, so just going to check the audio. Oh, it's watching me now, I think. Okay, so just going to check the audio. Oh, it's watching me now, I think. Okay, so just going to check the audio. Okay, there's this really weird interference thing happening. Okay, I think it's still there, but I'm not sure. Okay, that sounds better. Sorry about that, everyone. Using headset on this setup for the first time. But I digress. Welcome, everyone, to the Average Intelligence Podcast, solo special number 5. This was going to be a regularly scheduled podcast. However, my co-host, Eric, hope he doesn't mind me sharing with everyone, actually ended up going under the knife with acute appendicitis. So we wish him a speedy recovery. But I am here to deliver your regularly scheduled podcast. Tonight's a doozy. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the Fauci emails. And again, I apologize for that audio nonsense at the beginning, but I hope to make up for it. Super Chat is open for anyone wanting to chime in, and I'm just going to adjust myself a bit here. So these are in no particular order. These are just the emails that I found interesting, but I will make you privy to the dates on them because I sifted through a lot of emails. Not going to lie, there were over 3,000. I got to a little over 1,000 and wanted to pull my eyes out because the vast majority of these emails are simply Fauci forwarding them or telling people to get back to another person. So largely uninteresting. So then I just started doing research trying to find particular emails that I had heard about. But what I didn't want to do was take someone's word for it, because there were quite a few news stories that I found that were talking about an email, but then the screenshot that they showed had nothing to do with what they were talking about. So that was disheartening to say the least. However, that was then, this is now. So we will start with the first email. The first email that I found somewhat interesting was a response that Dr. Fauci sent the original sender, who is Dr. Ezekiel J. Emanuel, MD, PhD, who is, auto shutdown enabled, and it is diverted. So essentially, this is a professor from Levy University and co-director of Healthcare Transformation Institute. Dr. Emanuel's original email read something about he's apologizing for something with his phone. Is a person likely to be immune once they caught the coronavirus once? Do we know anything about likely drift? And Fauci's response was, no evidence in this regard, but you would assume that there would be substantial immunity post-infection. It is an RNA virus, and so you can expect mutations, but not sure how much is going on. We'll have to check. Now, this was sent on March 4th, 2020. Both emails were at different times of day. And I found this one extremely curious because if you recall, with the vaccine, they're calling for people to get said vaccine even if they have had COVID. Now, I'm going to assume that they want people who have already had COVID-19 to get the vaccine purely for protection against the variants, which an mRNA vaccine has been pretty well proven to protect against the variants, at least in COVID-19. It will remains to be seen. It would depend upon the virus to know whether or not it would be beneficial for an mRNA vaccine to be useful against some, say, variants of, say, the flu virus, which, again, being not a scientist nor a doctor, it seems to me like an mRNA vaccine might be promising. It might need a little bit more work to it, but that might actually lead to a vaccination for something, say the common cold or the seasonal flu virus, provided they don't mutate that much. And I'm not sure I have no idea what the degree of mutation is with an influenza virus like that. But if anyone listening knows, feel free to hit that chat box and enlighten me. But I find this email extremely curious because, I mean, it's fairly common knowledge that you can expect at least a certain degree of immunity after contracting any virus. I mean, that's the whole point of getting a vaccine is you historically, before the mRNA vaccine was invented very recently, inoculation took place by giving one an isolated, dead, or weakened version of a virus. The body's immune system then identifies the virus, creates antibodies, and it then knows how to defend against the virus if it appears in the body again. I find it a little curious that, and I'm assuming, again, I'm giving Fauci the benefit of the doubt here because I'm assuming he's just chalking it up to, I don't know. He even says you would expect there to be substantial immunity post-infection. But this is curious to me because once we have the vaccine, we are now really, really pushing. I mean, the Biden administration in particular is really pushing for as close to, they're not pushing for 100% vaccination, but let's be real, they would love to have it. I want to say they were pushing for 80% vaccination, whatever the standard is for herd immunity, because you are going to have people with medical exceptions, and then you're obviously going to have some outliers in a free country. But my point being that if you've had COVID-19, then theoretically you would not need to get the vaccine. Now, I understand they want you to get the vaccine, and like I said, I'm going to give them the benefit. In my mind, I give them the benefit of the doubt on this one. And I'm assuming that they would want people to still get vaccinated to protect themselves from the variants that have been going around, which is really interesting because, and I didn't say this on the podcast because I honestly thought it sounded a little outlandish, but I kind of figured, so you have to take my word for this, and you can call bullshit on it if you want to. I don't really care. But I did say early on in the pandemic, I saw a discrepancy because some people were having like virtually no symptoms at all. And then other people were other people were dying, so one extreme to another. And I suspected, I even thought to myself, and I said out loud to a couple people, Eric being one of them, I said, I wonder if there are more than one strain. Now, I think my reasoning was wrong, but I do find it curious that we now have multiple strains of the COVID-19 virus. Well, maybe they were present in the United States, I'm not sure, but I'm getting off on a tangent. So our next email, and the other thing I want to do, it's very easy to get these confused. So I want to make sure that I'm not getting emails mixed together. Okay, so the next one, this is from March 3rd of 2020. And the original email was sent from, it's simply signed Tai Te Wu, and I do not know who this person is. But Wu's email reads, Dear Dr. Fauci, I have seen you on the television commenting about COVID-19. Therefore, I have decided to squeeze some information out of their nucleotide and amino acid sequences as enclosed. Oh, we got something on the super chat. Incriminating. I don't know that I agree with that. I really don't. After reading through a ton of these emails, I'll say this much. The right is really over emphasizing, and they're grasping at straws on some of these things. But then the left is pretending like none of these things are even here. So once again, this has become partisan. But anyway, where was I on Wu's email? I have decided to squeeze some information out of their nucleotide and amino acid sequences as enclosed, and they include the graphic, but it is redacted, so you can't see it. A lot of these emails have redacted information, obviously things like phone numbers, locations, and then other information, which I don't know why they were redacted, but they were redacted. But anyway, hope that you may find a cure with all the available data on this virus. Best regards, Tai Te Wu. And Fauci actually did not respond to this one, but it was forwarded to Christina Cassetti, who was with the National Institute of Health. It was actually sent as a Word document. It was an attachment. The attachment wasn't, like I said, the attachment was redacted, so I could not see the actual attachment. But I do find this, and again, this is the frustrating part about these emails, because we don't have a lot of context, which is why it's easy to infer certain things, which is why some people find them incriminating and other people find them as, circumstantial at best, because we don't know what was done with this attachment. However, I do find it, I'm going to assume, again, if I'm giving Fauci the benefit of the doubt, I'm going to assume that this attachment was garbage and not from any credible source. Like I said, Mr. or Ms. Wu is unidentified in terms of who they are and whether or not they have a medical background, but they are saying that they have information about nucleotide and amino acid sequences in the virus. So I think one could assume that they know something about virology, but again, just found that one curious. Next email. And this one is very interesting. This is from Dr. Arthur Bobrov from Stanford, from the Stanford VA, Stanford and Palo Alto VA, so the Veterans Association. And this was March 3rd, 2020. Dr. Fauci, since the elderly's response to pulmonary coronavirus infection may be impaired, especially in those with a chronic disorder, is there any information delivering by inhalation low concentrations of a zinc salt? Is there a potential rationale in early coronavirus infection to try to minimize serious pneumonia where such inhalation shown to be reasonably safe? Were such inhalations shown to be reasonably safe? And he's talking about zinc gluconate, I assume. And then Fauci does not respond to this email. He simply forwards it to NIAID public inquiries, which I'm assuming this is like a bulk email box where people that work with and for the organization can take this on and respond if they feel that there's a need. I do find this one curious because we have a doctor inquiring as to whether or not a treatment would be effective, and Fauci kind of just forwards it. I understand he was a busy man. I find this somewhat curious, though, which, again, we have no context for this. I just felt that one was noteworthy. And that's how a lot of these emails are, too, because there's not a lot of context. And like I said, there's a ton of these emails where Fauci just forwards it to someone else without even a word or saying, like, so anyway. So this is a longer one because it has some forwarded. Sorry, just making sure I have everything for this one because this one is okay. Okay, so this is a response sent on March 2nd, 2020 from Dr. Fauci, and all it says is see my edits in red for accuracy, because the original email was sent from a Michael Gerson, and his email reads as follows. This is the description portion of my column. I don't want to over or understate. America is entering a disturbing new stage in the coronavirus outbreak. There has been community spread in at least one and likely two locations in Washington state. This is very early on in the pandemic, if you remember, March 2nd, 2020. And it appears the virus was being transmitted for at least a few weeks before current cases were recognized. So we can expect dozens or hundreds of cases in these locations unless contact tracing is especially efficient. This means that means the disease is loose and easily transmitted. I need to look the dates up again, but this is also curious timing too, because I believe I believe Nancy Pelosi visited Chinatown sometime in late February, so this is not far after that. The crucial issue now is the real mortality rate, which remains uncertain. The stated mortality rate is 2%, which again, in hindsight, we now know that the mortality rate for COVID-19 is significantly lower. And there is another email that Fauci, even Fauci hypothesizes that it would be a much lower mortality rate than 2%, at least at some one point in the pandemic, which again flies in the face of some of what he was saying on television, but I digress. That's another email. American experts are hoping the rate turns out to be considerably lower. But the math remains troubling in any case. If only 5% of the population eventually gets infected, that's hysterical, which is on the low side of some estimates, and the mortality rate is 1%, there would still be a few 100,000 deaths. Which again, I'm not really sure. This is the problem with because he's a journalist. You know, he literally just said that the stated mortality rate is 2%, and then hypothesizes if a mortality rate was 1%. I mean, if not 1%, 5%. Why? If you're trusting the science, then why aren't you taking their stated mortality rate? Just some food for thought. It seems to me like he's trying, in his article or his column, he's trying to basically fearmonger here. Because he's pointing to some pretty high numbers and the math is sound, but again, the mortality rate is not 5%. But I digress. At this stage, the main tool that public health experts have is social distancing, the attempt to keep as many people as possible in affected areas out of sneezing distance from one another. This means measures such as closing schools, canceling events in theaters and stadiums, and encouraging employees to telework. States and localities ultimately make such decisions rather than the federal government, but according to some health experts I consulted, Washington State should be taking such measures right now. The effectiveness of social distancing is limited when action comes too late or ends too early. This is a valid point. The goal of such policies is to keep the RO, and in parentheses, reproduction ratio, as low as possible. He's meaning the virus reproduction, obviously. When people are in close proximity, a single infected person can spread the disease to several others. Well, actually, an infected person can spread a disease infinitely to as many people as around. The only variable there is how many people are around and how infectious the virus is and whether or not it's airborne. The wording of that is curious to me because it seems like, oh, he spread it to 5 people, he's done. No, and I've always said during the pandemic that even in the height of the pandemic that some of these guidelines are kind of silly because the masks in particular. So I'm trying to remember exactly what I said, but anyway, something to the effect of, if you have 2,000 people in a room and no one is sick, no one is going to get sick. But if you have 2 people in a room and one of them is sick, the other person is going to get sick. Like it's almost guaranteed, especially when it comes to COVID, something as infectious as this disease. As low as possible. When people are in close proximity, a single infected person can spread the disease to several others, boosting the RO of the disease as high as 2 to 3 and causing an exponential increase in cases. Again, we learned this in elementary or middle school when we first learned about viruses. This is nothing new. If the RO is less than 1, the epidemic will gradually decline and stop on its own, with or without a vaccine. Okay. A vaccine, however, would be tremendously helpful. There are at least 10 vaccine development projects underway. But the one furthest along at the National Institute of Health is still about 6 weeks away from starting a process. And then starting the process of Fauci adds an A. The original author had phase 1, and then this part is Fauci's addition. So it reads, starting the process of a phase 1 trial in human volunteers that will take 3 to 4 months to complete and to show that the vaccine is safe and produces specific antibodies. Sorry about that. A phase 2 trial will follow and will take at least 6 to 8 months to determine if the vaccine is efficacious in people at risk for infection. That is Fauci's amendment to the column. Then production would need to be scaled up by a willing pharmaceutical company to deal with the global crisis. All this, and then Fauci adds, in total will take at least a year, assuming there are no unprecedented scientific obstacles in the way. Well, it didn't take a year, did it? Oh, we got somebody else in the super chat. Hey, Scott, how's it going? So if the virus is from nature, where's the smoking bat? Later. We're going to touch on this a little bit later. There are some emails that deal with that, and that is one of the places where Fauci is. But yeah, we're going to get there. Trust me. And then Fauci also adds, Fauci also adds in response to the edits, Mike, social distancing is not really geared to wait for a vaccine, which is true, not specifically anyway. The major point is to prevent easy spread of infections in schools, in parentheses, right, closing them, crowded events such as theater stadiums, cancel events, or workplaces do teleworking where possible. States and localities make these decisions, not the federal government. The goal of social distancing is to prevent a single person who is infected to readily spread to several others, which is facilitated by close contact in crowds. Close proximity of people will keep the RO higher than 1 and even as high as 2 to 3. If we can get the RO to less than 1, the epidemic will gradually decline and stop on its own. I think he's just amending the wording there, making suggestions for how he would word it. In China, Q laughter. Hey, Eric, my co-host is in the super chat. That's funny. We'll have some thoughts on China at the close, and I'm going to try to breeze through these because there's a lot of emails, and I'd like this to be about an hour, but I will keep going until... Oh, these are all the same email. Like I said, it's really hard to read through these because a lot of them were extremely repetitive, and again, they're forward, so sometimes the message is duplicated. Okay, so this one is from, the next one is February 26th. Hi, everyone. Oh, they can see the super chat if they're watching. A lot of reading. This is from a Robert D. Geller. And the subject is simply COVID-19 questions. Tony, thanks for everything you were saying and doing. I'm writing to ask the latest. Thanks, Bob. That's weird. What about general care of a patient suspected of or confirmed? I'm sorry, I'll reread that. What about general care of a patient suspected or confirmed COVID-19? N95 or surgical mask? Any news on how this disease is being transmitted? Anything new on vaccine or treatment? And Fauci responds, Bob, thanks for the note. I hope that all is well with you. Use an N95 if you have them available. Transmission is similar to influenza, respiratory droplets, and likely a bit more as aerosol, with influenza than with influenza. Sorry. People can transmit even when they are asymptomatic. No approved therapies. However, we are doing clinical trials on repurposed drugs such as remdesivir, and then in parentheses he has Gilead. Vaccine going into phase 1 trial in about 6 weeks, but will not be ready for at least 1.5 years. Again, Operation Warp Speed. The good doctor was wrong. And curious here too, because one might chalk this up to think, oh, well, that's how long a vaccine normally takes. But again, as I said on the podcast, if you remember the H1N1, they had confirmed cases and a vaccine in the same year. By December of that same year, there was a widely available vaccine to anyone who wanted it. So I'm just curious this tells me, and again, this is a reach, so don't crucify me. This is a reach, and this is coming from me. This tells me that even here, they didn't quite understand what they were dealing with, which I think is a fair assessment. Because I think in the very early stages of the pandemic, it was kind of business as usual for the NIH and Fauci himself. Okay, so next email we have. This one is from a Morgan Fairchild. And this is February 26, 2020. Hi, Dr. Fauci. I'm reaching out to see if I can help in any way to get good information out to the public, as I tried to do with AIDS. Okay, so now I remember. Morgan Fairchild is someone who worked with Dr. Fauci during basically the AIDS crisis in the late 80s, early 90s. I have almost 100,000 Twitter followers and have been tweeting articles to them that I feel are helpful. But if you have any info I can help disseminate, please let me know. Also, great job today and this week. Hope you're well. Thanks. Best, Morgan. Morgan, thank you for the note and the offer to help. Let me know how my Fauci impression is, because I'll stop doing it if it sucks. It would be great if you could tweet to your many Twitter followers that although the current risk of coronavirus to the American public is low, the fact that there is a community spread of virus in a number of countries besides China, including South Korea, Japan, Italy, Iran, among others, poses a risk that we may have progress to a global pandemic of COVID-19. If that occurs, we will surely have many more cases in the USA. And so for that reason, the American public should not be frightened, but should be prepared to mitigate an outbreak in this country by measures that include social distancing, teleworking, temporary closure of schools, etc. I would like to point out that masks are not mentioned anywhere in those lists of advice. There is nothing to be done now since there are so few cases in this country, and these cases are being properly isolated, which now we know in hindsight they in fact weren't. And so go about your daily business. However, be aware that behavioral adjustments may need to be made if a pandemic occurs. Best regards, Tony. I'm not going to do my Fauci impression anymore because I don't like it. Okay, so this is one of the ones you guys have been waiting for. This is February 5th, 2020. And this is in response to a Sylvia Barwell who was basically asking questions about masks. Sylvia, masks are really for infected people to prevent them from spreading infection to people who are not infected, rather than protecting uninfected people from acquiring infection. The typical mask you buy in a drugstore is not really effective in keeping out virus, which is small enough to pass through the material. It might, however, provide some slight benefit in keeping out gross droplets if someone coughs or sneezes on you. I do not recommend that you wear a mask, particularly since you are going to a very low-risk situation, because Sylvia had been traveling somewhere and she was asking if she should wear a mask on an airplane. I remember the original email now. Your instincts are correct. Money is best spent on medical countermeasures such as diagnostics and vaccines, which I said from the very beginning. Now, this is the one that I really wanted to touch on here, because a lot of people are defending Fauci. We all know he flat out said in the beginning of the pandemic that masks are not necessary, or that people shouldn't be wearing masks. He actually said people shouldn't wear masks. Now, he later changed his stance, and he said that the reason he said this was because he wanted to make sure healthcare workers had access to PPE, which on the surface sounds legitimate. However, there are many arguments that can be made against this. One of which being, okay, well, you want to have PPE to protect medical workers, right? Because they're going to have an influx of COVID patients. That's his thought logic. Except that if masks work, if we assume that masks are effective at stopping the spread of COVID-19, then you would think that you would want the public to be wearing masks, because then they won't get COVID and then they won't flood the medical facilities and risk infecting medical personnel. So that's problem number one. And here's problem number two with this logic. I mean, it's right here. Dr. Fauci himself says that masks are ineffective with virus, and then says masks are really for infected people to prevent them from spreading infection to people who are not infected. So again, by this logic, the excuse that he wants to make sure medical professionals have PPE doesn't make sense, because if these masks, now granted, these are not surgical masks he's talking about, but again, like, bear with me. If the purpose of a mask is to stop infected people, is to prevent infected people from infecting non-infected people, you would want these people to have masks. I mean, am I wrong in my thought process here? See, this is the one that really gets me, and it's not because I truly don't care. I know Eric's a little bit more militant about this, but I truly didn't care about wearing a mask. What I didn't like was being given, by either intention or incompetence, false information. Because I get it, it makes sense. Like, you figure a mask will offer some protection against some things, like you'll get less spit on you, I suppose, but it's not enough to stop a microscopic virus, at least not the standard mask like that. Sorry, just making sure. I know that. I'm sorry about that dead silence. I'm just making sure that I've got all this in one email. Okay, so this is a forward. This is a forward to Fauci, which I don't think he responded to, but take this one with a grain of salt for me, because I don't, because the top part is redacted, so I don't know if he commented on this or if it was just forwarded. But anyway, the email is addressed to a John, but it was forward. The email was sent to John Mascola from the National Institute of Health, from David Monfiore. I believe I'm pronouncing his name right, Dr. David Monfiore. But anyway, the email reads, John, spike mutation pipeline reveals the emergence of a more transmissible form of SARS-CoV-2. And then it lists a bunch of things that I cannot, but I'll read them anyway. Corber B1, Fisher WM1. I'm guessing it's Nanakaran S1, Yoon H1, Thieler J1, Abfalterer W1, Foley B1, Georgie EE1, Bhattacharya T1, Parker MD3, Partridge DG4, Evans CM4, De Silva TI4 and 5, on behalf of the Sheffield COVID-19 genomics groups La Branche CC2 and Monfiore DC2. Summary: we have developed an analysis pipeline to facilitate real-time mutation tracking of SARS-CoV-2, focusing initially on the spike S protein because it mediates infection of human cells and is the target of most vaccine strategies and antibody-based therapeutics. To date, we have identified 14 mutations in spike that are accumulating. Mutations are considered in a broader phylogenetic context, geographically and over time, to provide an early warning system to reveal mutations that may confer selective advantages in transmission or resistance to intervention. Each one is evaluated for evidence of positive selection, and the implications of the mutation are explored through structural modeling. The mutation spike D614G is of urgent concern. It began spreading in Europe in early February, and when introduced to new regions, it rapidly becomes the dominant form. Also, we present evidence of recombination between locally circulating strains, indicative of multiple strain infections. These findings have important implications for SARS-CoV-2 transmission, pathogenesis, and immune interventions. This is from May 5th, 2020. So it seems like, and that seems about right as to when they would be figuring out that there were different strains. But yeah, so that one was rather curious. That at least it didn't show the response, which means there may have been something confidential in there. All right, this next one is Fauci responding. Basically responding to some questions. Responding to, oh, okay, yeah, the subject reads, coronavirus questions for the Office of the Surgeon General. And it simply reads, thanks for your note. Shown below are my answers to your questions. I hope that you find them helpful. 1. How do you recommend I reassure our staff on dealing with the stressors of COVID-19? Fauci responds, this is indeed an unprecedented and stressful time. Stress can often come from the unknown. In times of stress, it is critical to take care of one's physical health, so you close gyms, by eating well, getting enough sleep, and exercising, which again, you close gyms. And in some places, we're telling people they couldn't be outside. So I'd like to know how you were supposed to exercise when you're supposed to be locked in your house. In addition, maintaining connections with family and friends via phone calls, email, and video chatting, while physically, socially distancing is very important. By the way, this is dated April 21st, 2020. Question 2. Can COVID-19 be contracted from a corpse? Fauci responds, infection control measures should be undertaken when dealing with deceased individuals with a known or suspected COVID-19. The CDC provides guidance for this issue here, and it's just a hyperlink. I mean, do they normally handle corpses without, protective equipment? This is a legit question. I don't know. I would think they did, but there's weird shit all over the place. I don't know. Question 3. If someone has a user of hydroxychloroquine for years, are they susceptible to contracting COVID-19? And Fauci responds, clinical trials are underway to determine if hydroxychloroquine is effective in preventing COVID-19 in exposed persons. Until we know the answer to this question, persons who take hydroxychloroquine on a daily basis for another medical condition should consider themselves vulnerable to COVID-19 and take appropriate and recommended measures to protect themselves. Again, that's fairly sound advice. The problem with this is that hydroxychloroquine as a therapeutic was largely dismissed, with the exception of Trump and a handful of doctors that were seemingly silenced by the mass media, or at least not reported on. I shouldn't say they were silenced, but they were labeled as crackpots, basically. Question number 4. This is a doozy. And remember answers to this question posed before. Are masks and gloves truly effective? If so, why are there so many medical professionals contracting the virus? Fauci responds, I believe that infection control strategies, which include proper use of personal protective equipment, PPE, as recommended by the CDC, are effective. And he provides another hyperlink. In cases where inadequate PPE is worn, or if it is not taken off according to proper procedure, the risk of contracting COVID is increased. In addition, healthcare workers on the front lines can be exposed if they encounter a patient who is not initially suspected of having COVID-19 without PPE, especially if they are exposed to aerosol generating processes. Okay, I could see that, except, and again, correct me if I'm wrong here, anytime I interacted with anyone, even remotely in the medical field for any reason, like when I had to get my COVID test before I could go into surgery, the nurse that administered my test literally had on a surgical mask and then a full face protector. Full, like, looked like a hazmat suit. Full fastened gloves, like there were no gaps in this thing. Anytime I was in a hospital, they all had PPE. At the surgery center, when I had my surgery, they were all wearing PPE. They didn't ever not have it on unless when I was unconscious, which I was in an operating room, so I hope to God they had it all on. I would think so. So again, Fauci kind of dodges the question here. And it irks me because so many times he said that we didn't know, but for some reason on this one, nobody ever said that, nobody ever just said we don't know, so this is what we recommend, but we're not sure, which I find extremely curious. Question number 5. What is the most important thing we should be doing other than social distancing? Fauci responds, social distancing is key in order to avoid coming into contact with someone with COVID-19. But washing one's hands often, or using an alcohol-based hand sanitizer, and avoiding touching one's face with unwashed hands are critical as well, especially when coming into contact with surfaces that may have been touched by others or public places. Which again, this is fairly common. He gives another link to the CDC. And then question number 6. Finally, what keeps you up at night regarding COVID-19? Fucking journalist here. And Fauci responds, I have said in the past that what keeps me up at night is the possibility of a pandemic respiratory infection. We are in that reality now, and what keeps me up at night is the response, a major part of which is the development of an effective vaccine and treatments for COVID-19. Well, really, Dr. Fauci, I find that humorous considering that years ago, when you were asked about the validity and the efficacy of gain-of-function research, you said, and I quote, and you were quoted as saying this, that a global pandemic was worth the risk. So I sincerely hope for your sake, even though this has pretty well been all but proven from what I can tell, that you were not, in fact, funneling money to these virology labs that were performing gain-of-function research. I really do hope for yours. I truly hope that it's not the case. I really, really hope that you just weren't aware. But even when you were grilled and feigned ignorance and basically just said, well, we don't know, we have to trust them. It's like, no, we don't have to trust them. In fact, why do you trust anybody? If you connect these dots, it just seems pretty evident that at least it was negligence. I'm not one of the people that thinks that the lab in Wuhan weaponized this intentionally, but I do think that I think they were performing gain of function research and the negligence, because again, this lab apparently had a history of negligence. So I'm not sure why you think it's any different. So this email right here is kind of the one that, or at least I think this is the one. Or there's two here actually, but they're from the same person. So this is simply from a George, however, it has his name. It has his name in Chinese. It was George Gao. I'm going to look for chronological order here. So the first email from George is from March 28, 2020. And it reads, Dear Tony, I know you're working extremely hard with a lot of pressure. Hope the U.S. situation is getting better eventually. I saw the scientific interview. How could I say such a word, big mistake, about others? That was journalist's wording. Hope you understand. It was not a real interview, but a Q&A through social media for several days when he there's a typo. He means when he asked me what China has done and is working on. Let's work together to get the virus out of the earth. Best wishes, George. And then Fauci simply responds, George, thanks for your note. I understand completely. No problem. We will get through this together. Best regards. I mean, that's nice, but... And then this is the other one, which again, this one in particular was kind of labeled as a smoking gun, but it doesn't really say much. Smoking gun as far as people on the right were concerned. Another one from George. This one is April 8th. I apologize. This one is April 8th, sent from George. Tony, I saw some news, hopefully it is fake, that are being attacked by some people. Hope you are well under such irrational situation. All the best and stay safe. BW George. And then on the 11th of April, Tony responds, George, thank you for your kind note. All is well despite some crazy people in this world. Warm regards, Tony. Now, a lot of people accused Fauci of being condescending here, but I mean, if we're being real, there were a lot of crazy people. So I don't really see that much as a smoking gun. And again, I find it curious that anyone thought they would actually find anything incriminating in these emails, because this is like, I mean, the Freedom of Information Act exists. So I would think if you wanted to do some real covert things a la Hillary, you would have a private email server. All right, and then this next one. And this one's just layered. This one's just funny. And it's not because of Fauci, it's because of the original message. And Fauci's response is kind of funny, but again, this is from a Karen Bex. Hi, Dr. Fauci, and this is April 3rd, 2020. Hi, Dr. Fauci. Thank you so much for keeping things honest, and know that I am such a champion of you. I hope that reaching out is okay. I work at HHS I believe it's iOS team. As I sit here at home and I've been thinking about the shortage of medical supplies, doggy cones actually can be used as protection for our healthcare workers. Just a thought that looks and sounds crazy, but can help. Stay safe. And Fauci simply says, Karen, thanks for the note. Come on, really? Doggy cones. Okay. Yeah, that's one of the crazy aforementioned people. Oh, lovely. So this one cut out on me. I'm going to have to check out my phone for this one. So bear with me one moment because my printout actually cut it out. I just have to find it on the phone. Okay, so this is from Dr. Fauci in response to a Christian G. Anderson, sorry. And the original email from Christian reads, Hi, Tony. Thanks for sharing. Yes, I saw this earlier today, and both Eddie and myself are actually quoted in it. It's a great article, but the problem is that our phylogenetic analyses aren't able to answer whether the sequences are unusual at individual residues, except if they are completely off. On a phylogenetic tree, the virus looks totally normal, and the close clustering with bats suggests that bats serve as the reservoir. The usual features from the virus make up a really small part of the genome, less than 0.1%, so one has to look really closely at all the sequences to see that some features potentially look engineered. Now, this looks like a smoking gun. It does. And then there is a but later on in the same email chain, and I have to find the particular one. Let me find it. It's just later on in the same email chain. The same Christian Anderson does go on to pretty much say that they're pretty sure that the virus looks to be natural. Now, again, this is February 1st, 2020. However, the point of this email is that there was at least potential speculation that it was possible that this virus was in fact engineered in a laboratory. It's right here. This right here is pretty much the only smoking gun there is, but it's only kind of a smoking gun because, again, the same person that goes into, because he'd forwarded them an article of a paper that was published. Sorry, he'd forwarded him a paper that was published, but the title of the paper is COVID-19 Coronavirus Epidemic Has Natural Origin, Scientists Say. And this paper was published later on in March. So they were even talking about the paper before it was published. Oh, no, I apologize. Two different papers. So the paper that was published. So actually, I'm sorry, I got this all mixed up. Like I said, some of these are really hard. Fauci responded on February 1st. The original email citing that some of the features of the virus potentially look engineered, or potentially is in parentheses, was January 31st, 2020. So say what you will about the conspiracy theories, but as far back as January of 2020, there was at least a known possibility that this virus could have been engineered in a laboratory. Yet it was dismissed until after Biden won the election. So again, not being a Republican shill, not being a conspiracy theorist, just looking at information and thinking, that's curious. Because they were literally, Tim Cotton, I believe his name was, silenced. I believe it was actually banned on Twitter for suggesting that the virus could have been engineered in a laboratory, for basically spreading nonsense, for spreading lies. And yet, here we are. And then later on, talking about the lab leak theory, which I even, just me personally, and Eric and I both agreed with this, we were pretty convinced that the virus was created in a lab, albeit accidentally let out. And then there was Brett Weinstein, sorry, can't say Weinstein. Brett Weinstein was on Joe Rogan's podcast, and Brett Weinstein, for those who don't know, is an evolutionary biologist. He even said that he had seen the virus basically, and that there were indicators in the virus's genome, and I'm trying to paraphrase it, but remember what he said. There were elements of the virus that suggested that it was lab created. And I believe his exact words, because there were parts of the genome structure that were too perfect. But again, don't take my word for it. You can search it on YouTube. Look up Brett Weinstein, Joe Rogan podcast, JRE. This would have been in early to mid 2020. I apologize, I can't remember the exact date. But continuing on, talking about this email, on April 16th, Francis Collins, the director of the U.S. National Institute of Health, emailed Dr. Fauci saying conspiracy gains momentum in relation to the lab leak hypothesis. And unfortunately, Fauci's response to this was completely redacted. Which is hysterical, because Fauci has now said that he's not 100% convinced that the virus is natural in origin. But if you remember, in the early days of the pandemic, everyone was saying, oh, it comes from bats. Now, again, I understand how they could come to that hypothesis, but they were stating this as fact. If you remember, it was all over the news saying, oh yeah, this comes from bats. Because there are coronaviruses that have transferred from bat to human. All right, and then this. Now, there is something I wanted to touch on here, because I've already pissed off the liberals enough. There are several emails, and I'm not going to read. I think there's one later on specifically, but there are many emails sent to Fauci that are asking him if he is being silenced. And on every single one, at least that I saw, Fauci has assured everyone he is not being. This is during the Trump administration. He assures everyone that he is not being muzzled, that he is, not being told what to say and how, like what to say, when to say, what not to say. And I believe that, because if you remember, it was pissing Trump off, and I really don't care that it was pissing Trump off, but. And some people were asserting that Fauci was, being silenced, and it demonstrates once again how our society at large suffers from short-term memory loss, because it was not that long ago that people were outright complaining that Dr. Fauci was in fact not being silenced and was saying whatever the hell he wanted to say. And then we have another email. And then this one was quite funny. In response to being asked about the redacted information from that email that I just mentioned, Fauci responded, he did not remember the substance of the email, saying, quote, "They only took about 10,000 emails from me. Of course I remember. I remember all 10,000 of them. Give me a break. I don't remember what's in that redacted, but the idea I think is quite far-fetched that the Chinese deliberately engineered something so that they could kill themselves as well as other people. I think that's a bit far out, John." Now, so I have kind of a mantra, I guess a proverb, I don't know. And it's basically pay attention to the words people use because they're not trivial. The way he answers this question is actually really, really like this is Brave New World territory. And the reason I say this, when in response to the lab leak theory, Fauci says, I think it's quite far-fetched that the Chinese deliberately engineered something so that they could kill themselves as well as other people. He's not saying he doubted that the Chinese created it in a lab. He's saying that he doubted that they created it so that they could kill themselves as well as other people. So he's basically saying that it's far-fetched that the Chinese government had this lab develop this virus so that it could be weaponized and unleashed on the world. That is not what the lab leak theory is. And I think it's important that we look at things like this. And I could be completely wrong. Like, let's be frank. I mean, this is the average intelligence podcast. And our mascot is a chimp wearing a suit for a reason. So I am not the guy to make this call, but I'm just looking at that. I'm looking at the wording and I'm like, oh yeah, that's a great way to not deflect. That's a great way to deflect because it's borderline a straw man argument because you're taking the hypothesis and inflating it to a place that is easily defendable because yes, I think it is a bit far-fetched to assume that the Chinese government had a lab engineer a virus just so they could unleash it on the world and kill people in China as well as the rest of the world. I don't think it's far-fetched to say that a Chinese virology lab was doing gain-of-function research, and in order to do so, created a virus and engineer it specifically so that it can be infectious to humans, so that they can study it and try to find a cure for it. But during that research, someone was negligent and contracted the virus in the lab and then went out into the outside world. I don't think that's far-fetched at all. In fact, if you've seen the movie Outbreak, it happened. It happened in Outbreak. That's how one of them got sick. They were in the lab and their hose thing got caught. Dramatic, I know, but still. So kudos to anyone who's sticking through this because this is where the fun starts. So this is a forward from Fauci, or sorry, a forward to Fauci. Oh no, I'm sorry. This is a forward from Fauci. I'm sorry, sent to the NIAID public inquiries. It was forwarded on Wednesday, March 11th, and it was sent on March 11th as well. And this is from an Adam, I'm going to say Gartner, but it's spelled Gaertner. And it reads, "Hello, Anthony. This is how the virus was created. And I am apologizing in advance for my pronunciation, but here we go. Intervirion fusion, HIV-LUC ACE2 500 ng, I'm assuming is nanograms, of P24 was mixed with 1000 nanograms or ng of P24 of HIV-GSP particles incorporating ASLV-A envelope. SARS-CoV-S protein, or both envelopes in PBS at 4 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes to allow binding. Samples were raised to 37 degrees Celsius for 15 minutes to allow more conformational rearrangements. Virions were adjusted to the desired pH with 0.1 m citric acid. I'm not sure what measurement he's going for there. PBS TPCK trypsin, final concentration 10 some weird UG. I remember what this is, but I don't remember. Per milliliter. It's so this measurement, imagine a P without the top. It's almost like the base of a P and then a U attached to it. So we'll call it a PUG / ml. Any chemist out there is wanting to murder me right now. CTSL, cathepsin B, CTSB, final concentrations 2 PUG per milliliter, or CTSL buffer alone was then added. Recombinant CTSL R&D systems was pre-activated by incubation for 15 minutes at 10 PUG per milliliter in 50 little m, capital M, MES, pH 6.0 on ice. Recombinant CTSB R&D systems was pre-activated in 25 little m, big M, MES, 5 little m, big M, DTT, pH 5.0 for 30 minutes at 25 degrees Celsius. After a 10-minute incubation at 25 degrees Celsius, proteolysis was halted by the addition of 300 pL of DMEM10 containing lupeptin 25 PUG per milliliter and STI 75 PUG per milliliter. Virions were then incubated at 37 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes to allow membrane fusion. 100 pL of the virion mixture was added in quadruplicate to HeLa-TVA cells pre-treated for 1H with lupeptin 20 PUG per milliliter. The cells were spin infected and incubated at 37 degrees Celsius for 5 hours. If you're as confused as I am, hit that like button. Because I don't know what the hell he meant. But basically, it looks like he's writing that. Now, this formula could be total BS. I don't know. But, and again, giving Fauci the benefit of the doubt here, because he saw this email. I'm guessing that anyone who looked at this and knew what it said thought this was nonsense. I have to believe that. Because, frankly, it seems like nonsense. But this person did email Fauci, and he told him how the virus was created. So that's hilarious. So now this is an article that quotes some of the emails, and I figured this would just be a little bit faster because it also gives some context. And I believe this is the last piece of information I have for you, so I will simply read this article, give some context, and then we will wrap this up. Peter Daszak, a zoologist whose nonprofit steered U.S. funding to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, thanked Dr. Anthony Fauci for pushing back on the theory that the coronavirus leaked from a lab in an April 2020 email published as part of a Freedom of Information Act request by BuzzFeed. So, Scott, this is your smoking gun that you were wanting. I told you I'd wait till the end because I'm a whore like that. Daszak's organization, the Eco Health Alliance, funneled $3.4 million in grants from the National Institutes of Health to the Wuhan Institute of Virology to study bat coronaviruses between 2014 and 2019. Interesting timeline. While politicians and scientists in the U.S. have suggested that the novel coronavirus initially leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology caused by an earthquake, you'd have to look and see when... I don't know, Scott. Scott asked, is there any possibility the lab leak could have perhaps been caused by an earthquake? I don't think so, because there weren't. I didn't read anything about an earthquake in the area, because one would think that in the event of a natural disaster, the lab would have been temporarily shut down. But I don't know. That would be a question for the Google machine. But here's your smoking gun, so be excited. Let's see. Daszak's organization, the Eco Health Alliance, funneled $3.4 million in grants from the National Institutes of Health to the Wuhan Institute of Virology to study bat coronaviruses between 2014 and 2019, while politicians and scientists in the U.S. have suggested that the novel coronavirus initially leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology before spreading across the globe. Daszak has vehemently denied the allegation. Quote, I just wanted to say a personal thank you on behalf of our staff and collaborators for publicly standing up and stating that the scientific evidence supports a natural origin of COVID-19 from a bat to human spillover, not a lab release from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, Daszak wrote to Fauci on April 18th, 2020. Now, people on the right tend to see this as a smoking gun, and it may very well be. However, they've traced the funding. They know that the funding was going to Wuhan, but that's never been disputed. What has been disputed, Scott's happy. What's been disputed is whether or not the Wuhan Institute of Virology was conducting gain-of-function research. It seems like they were. It truly does seem like they were. They were at least getting money to study novel coronaviruses. Or study coronaviruses. I shouldn't say novel coronaviruses, because that would be technically incorrect. Or at least technically unproven, because if they were performing gain-of-function research, they would be studying novel coronaviruses. The article goes on. From my perspective, your comments are brave. This is still quoting, by the way. From my perspective, your comments are brave, stunning and brave. And coming from your trusted voice, that wasn't part of the quote, by the way. That was my quote. I inserted it because I can. Coming from your trusted voice will help dispel the myths being spun around the virus's origins, Daszak added. Fauci responded to Daszak's email on April 19th, writing, "Many thanks for your kind note." Now, this is also interesting because remember how Fauci earlier in the pandemic was saying that it was likely that the virus originated from bats. Going again, let's go back to the mantra of pay attention to the words people use. Daszak says, quote, will help dispel the myths being spun around the virus's origins, as if he knows for certain that this virus was not engineered in a laboratory. Now, I find this curious, considering we never found the host animal. It's never been found. They did not find the bat. They simply hypothesized that it was a bat to human transfer, which again is a scientifically valid hypothesis, but until you find the host animal, you cannot be sure. Again, Dustin Hoffman and Outbreak taught me that. Daszak was referring to Fauci's comments on April 17th when a reporter asked him to address concerns that the coronavirus could have been leaked from a lab. And this is a quote from Fauci. There was a study recently where a group of highly qualified evolutionary virologists looked at the sequences there and the sequences in bats as they evolve. Fauci said at the time, the mutations that it took to get from the point where it is now totally consistent with the jump of a species from an animal to human. Again, this is, yes, it's not only possible, it's scientifically likely. But to dismiss the theory that it was engineered in a lab, again, considering all the concerns that had been voiced prior, is scientifically disingenuous at best and potentially criminally negligent at worst. But the article continues. Fauci has continued to say it is highly likely that the coronavirus has a natural origin, although he said earlier in May 2021 that he was not convinced that coronavirus developed naturally. Now, again, that quote is taken somewhat out of context because Fauci does go on to say in that interview that it still seems likely that it is a natural origin. On February 4th, 2020, Sylvia Burwell, a former Secretary of Health and Human Services under Barack Obama and the current president of American University in Washington, D.C., emailed Dr. Fauci with a question. Oh, this is the email I was talking about earlier where she was traveling asking about masks. So I'm going to skip this part of the article because it just repeats that email. Typical mask you buy in a store, blah, 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 blah. And then after it quotes that email, the emails show that Fauci, now White House chief medical advisor, stuck to the line that only infected people should wear masks for several weeks after the exchange with Burwell. On February 22nd, Fauci signed off on responses drafted by the NIAID spokesperson to 12 interview questions from a Greek newspaper. And the last question read, which are protective measures anyone should take against the new virus? Do masks work? And Fauci responded to this saying, quote, "The vast majority of people outside of China do not need to wear a mask," read the Fauci approved response. "A mask is more appropriate for someone who is infected than for people trying to protect against infection." And as we all know, that tune changed. On March 8th, 60 Minutes broadcast a now infamous interview with Fauci in which he insisted there's no reason to be walking around with a mask. Again, you can YouTube this. In part because it could lead to a shortage of masks for people who really need it. Again, this is going back to the healthcare workers needing PPE. Earlier in the podcast, we touched on that. Don't need to rehash it. Go back and watch. Get our views up. And then, of course, be sure to listen on Spotify as well as wherever you get your favorite podcasts, except we're not on Apple Podcasts yet, but it's coming. 8 days after the interview aired, Fauci received an email from a man named Michael Liu, spelled like Liu Kang fame, Michael Liu, with the subject line, "Great advice from Chinese expert." The expert that Liu cited was Dr. Wen, I'm guessing it's pronounced Wenhong Cheng, the head of the infectious. I apologize to everyone who may or may not be watching from China, or who is of Chinese ancestry, or who shares a surname with this person, because I'm sure I butchered that. It is spelled Zhang. I believe that is pronounced Cheng, but I apologize if I mispronounced that. The head of the infectious disease unit at Huashan Hospital in Shanghai. The email did not mention that did not mention that the expert is a Communist Party official who first gained media fame in China when he announced in January 2020 that he would send doctors and nurses who were party members to frontline hospitals. According to Dr. Sheng's video, COVID-19 can really be prevented with 3 key measures. Example, to keep social distancing, wash hands frequently, and wear masks, Liu wrote. "I strongly suggest American people should wear masks like Chinese, South Korean people do, etc. Because even China's highest leader, Mr. Jinping wears masks." Liu signed off his email with the message, "God bless you, God bless America, China, and the whole world." I find that funny, considering I think China is pretty anti-religion. You know, it's not like they have concentration camps or anything. Oh, wait. That's right, they do. "Thank you for your note," Fauci responded. "We indeed have learned much from our Chinese colleagues, especially in gain-of-function research." That's not a true statement. That's a joke. Call me out on that. "I appreciate your bringing these issues to our attention." He signed the message Tony, which he signs most of his things Tony. So by the end of March, Fauci had become more receptive to the idea of masking up. As he wrote to a Dr. David Katz in La Jolla, California, on the last day of the month, "There is some data from the National Institute of Health that indicate that mere speaking without coughing elicits aerosols that can travel a foot or two. If that is the case, then perhaps universal wearing of masks is the most practical way to go." On April 3rd, then President Donald Trump announced that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention was recommending Americans wear cloth or fabric coverings in public places. States like New York soon announced that residents should wear masks when social distancing was not possible. The guidance would not be lifted until last month, when the CDC announced non-vaccinated people could ditch their masks in almost any situation. This article was published on June the 3rd. So I find that very intriguing, that probably answers why Fauci changed his tune on masks, or at least it reinforced his decision to change his tune on masks. And I did say the one thing that I think is the most positive to come out of this pandemic is the normalizing of wearing masks when one is sick. Because again, many places in the world, including Asia, Southeast Asia, this has been fairly common practice for many, many years. I mean, a very long time. If you're not feeling well, or if you're concerned about an illness, people wear a surgical mask. That, I think, is a good thing. And I'm glad that it has become normalized, because I will feel a lot safer during flu season, because if for no other reason, if someone is wearing a mask when they don't feel well, that tells people around them, hey, I'm not feeling well, should probably steer clear. which I do the same thing when someone coughs in public. Unfortunately, sometimes that can be too late. So there you have it. And these were the emails that I found the most damning. So that was the closest to a smoking gun, Scott. I'm sorry that you're probably disappointed that it wasn't quite the smoking gun you wanted, but I digress. Um, what I took away from this mostly was that just like everything else in this pandemic, it's heavily politicized because if you're firmly entrenched in the liberal camp and the anti-Trump camp specifically, you feel that you've received these emails to be a vindication for Fauci because nothing was clearly stated in terms of funding gain of function research, and there are indications that Fauci changed his mind on masks, but there are reasons why illustrated in the emails. And then if you are on the right, oh, Scott, I got to remember to read the super chat. Scott writes, Michael Jackson wore masks back in the 80s to protect himself from the flu while going out into a large fan crowds after the concerts. Google it. Oh, no, I believe you. And there were a handful of people, but societally it wasn't exactly common. There were a handful of people that did it, though. And I imagine Michael may have picked this up from touring in Southeast Asia. And it is also worth noting that in the Spanish flu outbreak, people were wearing masks, and there were mask mandates in many, many towns for the Spanish flu outbreak in the early 1900s, 1918-ish Spanish flu. You can Google those images too, and there are people wearing masks and there are people protesting, trying to tell people to wear masks. But yeah, I'm sure, and in fact, I think I've seen Michael Jackson wearing masks in videos and whatnot. I'm just saying I'm glad that this has kind of become normalized across the board. So that was a good thing. Well, I'm going to wrap this one up because I'm sure I've bored everyone to tears reading emails and articles, but we wanted to touch on the Fauci emails. Oh, Scott again. Oh, Scott says, good observation about Southeast Asia and Michael. I'm just making an assumption, but that would be my guess. Because there's a lot of media I've seen come out of Southeast Asia where it's just it's not trivial. Like it just is. You're welcome, Scott. Scott just said thanks. But anyhow, we will wrap this up. Hopefully, Eric is feeling better next week so we can get back to our regularly scheduled our normal place of operations. But we promise we will have a good show for you next week. And then just a quick reminder that the Average Intelligence podcast is on Spotify. It is also on Google Podcasts, Anchor.fm, and will be coming soon to Apple Podcasts. And there are a couple of smaller podcast outlets, but you can check all that out at anchor.fm/average-intelligence. There's not a link there now because I forgot it, but I will put a link in the description to the audio podcast format so you can check those out. And we will wrap this one up. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you on the next one. And of course, always check out you can always go back and watch this video again after the live is over. Have a good night, and